Welcome back, guys, to the JPS Podcast. This is episode 28, and I'm your host, Jacob Skeppers. And I apologize for the little hiatus I've had on the podcast the last few months. It's been an extremely busy time for myself and my family, which has meant that I haven't had the pleasure of interviewing as many guests as I would have liked. But we're going to finish the year strong, and I'm very excited to welcome James Krieger onto the show today. Welcome, James.
Thank you for having me, Jacob.
And guys, I'm not going to give you a big rundown on James's background and go into all of those things. We're going to get straight into the nitty-gritty of today's discussion. If you want to know all that, head to, this is going to test me now, James, weightology.net.
Yep, that's it.
Got it in one. I get that wrong every time. Head to weightology.net. Check James out. Super smart dude, puts out a lot of really good content. And today we're going to be actually talking about his set volume Bible, which he recently posted on his research review. And we're going to go into all things, volume as it relates to hypertrophy and resistance training. So, James, first, can you outline to the listeners, what the purpose of this research review was, and just give an overview of, your meta-analysis of set volume?
So the purpose of the research review was I wanted to write the most complete article that you could find anywhere on training volume. And I wanted to cover it from every angle. As far as training volume, when I say training volume, I mean set volume, so number of sets. And I wanted to cover every angle of how set volume could possibly impact muscle hypertrophy. So I covered everything from the research on the impact of set volume on muscle protein synthesis. I went into anabolic signaling. I went into satellite cell proliferation, impact of set volume on that. And then I went into the actual research on muscle gains. And I even covered some of the research on strength gains because obviously there's some correlation between strength gains and muscle gains. It's not perfect. It's actually a fairly rough correlation, but there's still the things, there's information you can still kind of glean from some of that data. So I put it all together, and basically there's a word called consilience. And what consilience means is when you have pieces of evidence from different areas, if you can if those show consilience as far as coming all kind of pointing to the same conclusion, then you can kind of get a pretty rough idea as, hey, this is a pretty good conclusion. I always like to use the example of evolutionary theory. The level of consilience there is off the charts. I mean, that's why we basically considered evolution a fact, because you've got evidence from genetics, you've got evidence from the fossil record, you've got evidence from biology, you've got there's so many different areas of science that all the evidence points together to the same conclusion. And so I tried to do the same thing with training volume. Obviously, it's not going to be quite to the same level because there's just too many unknowns still. But I wanted to at least kind of get an idea of where, what's kind of the big picture. If I look at all these different forms of evidence, are they pointing to different conclusions, or are they kind of all pointing to the same conclusion? That's kind of what was the driving force behind that article. And then finally I came up with some rough evidence-based guidelines on how people could, structure their training programs, based on all that evidence. So,
yeah, I sat down and read it over a couple of hours because it is quite in-depth, detailed, and very well thought out. And that's what we're going to get into today is, breaking down your research without obviously giving the guys too much so that they don't have to subscribe to weightology.net. But when you were defining what is a set, this is what a lot of people I've found, in the big volume movement over the last couple of years have completely ignored. They just think that a set is a set, and they don't actually understand, the prerequisites that go into, what we deem as a set contributing to total weekly volume, if that's how we're going to measure hypertrophy. And you defined a set as moderate to high repetitions, approximately 8 reps or more, to or near muscular failure. Can you explain to the listeners who may not have read your article why you didn't include lower rep work below 8?
The reason I didn't include lower rep work is because when you train with really low repetitions, the overall volume in terms of repetition volume is so low that it's not quite as good for hypertrophy, even if you take your sets to failure. And so, and actually Brad Schoenfeld has a study out on that not too long ago. He compared, I think it was 3 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 4 rep max to 3 sets of 8 to 10. So the number of sets was the same, number of hard sets, but the hypertrophy was much greater in the sets of 8 to 10. So when your reps get too low, we can no longer consider a set as far, at least if we're talking in terms of hypertrophy. And so, and so that's why I defined any set as, approximately 8 reps, maybe give or take a rep, 8 reps or more. And really, when you look across the studies, that's typically what the typical rep ranges that have been used. So that's why I defined a set that way.
Awesome. Because if you hit 7 reps, it's like the Bermuda Triangle. You don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And you spoke about failure and proximity to failure being important for eliciting hypertrophy. And how close should our sets be when we're counting them to our weekly volume to produce adaptations, considering that if we hit failure too frequently, that can really impact our total weekly volume that we're able to achieve?
Yeah, so I generally consider probably anywhere from 1 to 3 reps short of failure, I think, is a good target. And the reason I say that is because there's some research out there that's showing that you get maximal motor unit recruitment once you hit about 3 reps short of failure. And then there's some other studies out there that showed really no differences in muscle gains between training to failure and training, probably just short of failure. So yeah, I say 1 to 3 reps short of failure is a pretty good target. I mean, you don't want to stop too far short. I mean, for example, if it's a 10 rep max set and you stop at rep 5, then that's stopping way too short. And the research shows that you're going to impair your gains when you do that. But if you stop at rep 8 or 9, on a 10 rep max set, you should be good. And if anything, it may allow you to do a little bit more volume because, you can really fatigue yourself with that last grinding rep or two, which all it's going to do is it affects your performance on subsequent sets, and it may even carry over into your performance the next day, especially if you're trying to train more frequently. So,
yeah, definitely. And in terms of proximity failure, so you mentioned 1 to 3 reps, from momentary muscular failure. Is there a difference with different intensities? So if we're using 60% and above, do we have the ability to stay a few reps shy? Whereas if we're using 60% or below, do we have to take that closer to failure, if not fail, for that to be counted towards a set?
So that's a good question. I would say with the real high rep stuff, I still think you're probably okay if you stop a few reps short. I mean, if it's a 25 rep max set and you stop at rep 23, I don't think those last 2 reps are really going to make that much of a difference. I will say that you probably the higher rep stuff you probably want to push just a little bit harder than the lower rep stuff, just because with the high rep stuff you definitely need to have that fatigue set in to get maximal motor unit recruitment. With the lower rep stuff, an 8 to 10 rep max set, you can start getting maximal motor unit recruitment very early in the set. But for real high rep stuff, 25 reps, let's say, I'm not, I don't think you have to push total failure, but you definitely, it should be pretty challenging, So there needs to be more work in that area as far as the more higher rep stuff. The tough thing about the higher rep stuff is and I've talked with Eric Helms about this, what's really tough about real high rep stuff is it's really hard to know whether you've really gone to failure or not. It's a lot harder to gauge because they can be so painful, especially like leg work. I mean, even just something like leg extensions, like high rep leg extensions, those can really hurt bad when you start getting up to rep 21, 22, 23. And the thing is, Eric has told me, when they do research studies on that, they've got people encouraging you, and a lot of people think they're done. If they got people encouraging them, they can actually get a few more reps of those high rep stuff. But it's just like sometimes it just becomes so painful that you just end up quitting. So so that's one of the detriments of real high rep stuff. That's why I tend to favor, at least for compound movements, I would say I tend to more favor the more moderate rep range. Yeah. I think it's just easier to push yourself a little bit, but also kind of know when you're, a rep or two shy of failure. And then for, then the isolation stuff, you can, especially upper body isolation stuff. Yeah, you can do your 25 rep max sets and whatever, and it's not that big of a deal. But so.
Awesome. And final thing on our definition for what can be deemed a set that attributes to our total weekly volume is which muscle group is the prime mover in that exercise. So can you outline to the listeners what you meant by this in your research review, and if this influenced your findings in any meaningful way?
Yeah, so it becomes tough because, like, for example, if you think of a bench press, a lot of people think of a bench press as a chest exercise, but the triceps are really also a prime mover in a bench press. And so, really, in that case, you really want to, that would count as a tricep movement. And so that's kind of how I define sets, is like, is it essentially acting as some type of prime mover in the exercise, then it counts as a set for that particular muscle group. So, a bench press, obviously your prime movers are your chest, your triceps, and also your anterior deltoids. Those are very heavily involved in a bench press. So you could count a set of a bench press as one set for chest, one set for triceps, and one set for anterior deltoids, really. And so that's kind of how I defined it in the research. There's not enough data to, let's say if I just did purely arm only work, tricep work to compound movements. There's not enough data to really tease out whether it's better to do isolation work or not. There's been very just few studies on that. I will say that theoretically there is a benefit to using more than one exercise for a particular muscle group, especially if that particular muscle group has more than one function. So, for example, we think of the triceps. If you're doing pressing movements, there's only one head of the triceps is really heavily involved in that, and you really need to do some overhead type, isolation movement to stretch out the long head and get. So it's like, so it depends on the structure of the muscle and everything too. But that's kind of how I counted a set in that particular review.
And it makes things a lot easier, doesn't it? And less laborious if we have, clear guidelines, I guess, as to what counts as a set for a muscle group, when it is the prime mover. Otherwise, it just gets too hard trying to, keep track of all your working sets for all your muscle groups. So I think that just makes sense from a practical standpoint.
Yeah.
And you first delved into a lot of the mechanisms behind hypertrophy and set volume's influence on those, which were muscle protein synthesis, anabolic signaling, and satellite cell proliferation, as you mentioned earlier. So let's talk about those individually. So set volume and muscle protein synthesis, you reviewed 3 studies from memory, and 2 of those were human, 1 was rodent. And what was the general consensus there in set volume eliciting change in protein synthesis, and were there any limitations to the studies?
Yeah, so the general consensus is that more is better, but we don't know where the upper limit is as far as protein synthesis. Really, the only good study is one by Bird and colleagues where they compared 3 sets of leg extensions to 1 set, and they found a much greater protein synthesis response over the next day and a half compared to 1 set. But that doesn't tell us anything about, well, what if you did 5 sets or 6 sets or whatever. That's really only good study. Yeah, there's a rodent study that just came out. I even reviewed it too in my research, one of my research reviews. The problem with that, what they considered a set, really it doesn't necessarily translate into a human set. They found protein synthesis to plateau off around, I think it was like 3 to 5 sets, but this was like electrical stimulation. It's not like these rats weren't resistance training, and so it's not necessarily applicable. The only thing that data can tell us is, there's probably a plateau in the response at some point, but we don't know where that is in humans. And then there was a third study where they compared 3 and 6 sets, but the problem is the sets weren't taken to failure, and so I don't consider that study really all that usable in trying to determine where where a limit might be. So there definitely needs to be more work in that area. All I can say is data does seem to indicate multiple sets are better than single sets, but how many in a single session, before you get a point of diminishing returns, I don't know. I can't say. So I may update the article. I have some ideas. I may look at some, or actually when I do my training frequency one, I may piece together some protein synthesis studies that didn't really look at volume, but there's a protein synthesis study that used 8 sets, and then there's a protein synthesis one that used 4 sets. I may just kind of look at the overall responses. You can't necessarily compare across studies. It's not the best thing, but I don't know. I still might want to see if there's any rough ideas I might get from that, but that's something for a future. So all I can say is multiple sets are better than single sets in a single session as far as your protein synthesis response, but who knows where that upper limit lies.
Awesome. And in terms of anabolic signaling, in your review, you looked specifically at an anabolic signal. I'm not even going to try and say it. I'm not a scientist. P706
SK phosphorylation. Yeah,
that's the one. And overall, the anabolic signaling data is showing that more is better, like you were mentioning with the muscle protein synthesis. But obviously, there's only so much we can do before exceeding what we can recover from. Now, I know you just alluded to that there isn't any idea as to where that upper limit lies, but what is your general thoughts on anabolic signaling before we do see that diminishing returns? Is it different to muscle protein synthesis? Do we have any information about that?
Unfortunately, we don't. I mean, right now the data just shows the more you do, the more anabolic signaling you get. But anabolic signaling doesn't always translate into actual muscle protein synthesis, so that needs to be remembered. And then, some of that anabolic signaling may also just be a response to, like, say, repair muscle damage and not necessarily go towards muscle growth. So all I can say is from an anabolic signaling standpoint, all the data indicates the more you do, the more anabolic signal you're going to get in a single session. But that doesn't necessarily mean the more you do in a single session, the better results you're going to get, because like I said, I mean, chances are the protein synthesis response is going to plateau off at some point, but also there's just a fatigue factor. You can do 30 sets in a session, but then it's going to take you so long to recover from, who cares how much anabolic signaling you stimulated? It's, again, there's a point of diminishing returns there. So that's the limitation of trying to use anabolic signaling. Like I said, all we can say is we know more is better, but who knows where the upper limit lies. That's why you gotta turn to actual training studies. So,
and that's what we'll get to in just a second. But the final mechanistic research that you looked at was satellite cells. Can you give the guys who may not be familiar with what satellite cells are responsible for in the muscle building process? Give them a rundown as to what that is and then what your research found, pertaining to them.
Yeah, so satellite cells are basically what, if you think of all the cells in your body, all the cells have a nucleus, that contains all the genetic material for every cell and things like that. Well, the interesting thing about muscle cells are have multiple nuclei. So each muscle cell doesn't just have one nucleus; it has multiple ones. And when a muscle cell grows, it can only grow to a certain point until that it needs more nucleus to even get bigger. And so that's where satellite cells come in. So basically satellite cells are like these dormant cells that will, if a muscle cell needs to grow, the satellite cells will donate their nuclei to that muscle cell, so it basically allows it to grow bigger and gives it extra genetic material, really. And so there's, so they play a pretty good, important role in hypertrophy. And so there's not a lot of data, but there is one study that showed that, double-digit weekly sets in the legs were better than single-digit weekly sets in the legs for satellite cell activity. So so that's what that study hints at least, getting into the double-digit weekly sets.
Awesome. And from there, you obviously went on to look at the applied research and the studies that actually measure hypertrophy in people who are following resistance training programs. And you reviewed quite a number of applied studies and mentioned that sample size was a key factor that has led to varied results in comparing set volume and its effects on muscle growth. So can you explain to listeners why this is, and why, if they are reading research and looking at these kind of research reviews, that this is an important limitation they should understand?
Yeah. So basically it comes like this. Changes in muscle size are very small. I mean, anyone who trains know that it's hard to build muscle, and it takes a long time to build any significant amount. And what that means is, if I'm a scientist trying to measure changes in muscle size, the changes are so small that if I don't have a lot of people in my study, just the differences between people can actually drown out the actual changes in size themselves. And so it can be really difficult if I got two groups of people, and one group's on a low volume program and one group's on a high volume program, and I want to see, okay, is the high volume program better for muscle growth? The problem is the changes in muscle growth are so small is that even if let's say the high volume group had double the muscle growth of the low volume group, there's so much genetic variance between different people and how they respond that it could even drown out those differences. And so, ideally you need really large sample sizes, 50 people per group, 100 people per group. That just doesn't happen in exercise science research. I mean, usually you got like maybe 10 people per group, something like that. And so that's a limit. So what happens is, you could have 10 studies comparing a high volume to a low volume program. And what will happen is, even if the high volume program is better, only a portion of those studies will actually find what we would call a statistically significant difference. And the other ones will all declare no difference, because there's just too much variance between how different people respond to the same training program. That ends up drowning out those small changes in muscle size. So, and that's even if you want to detect double the muscle gains. So that's a major limitation of resistance training research. And so that's why, Brad Schoenfeld and I and Dan Ogborn collaborated on a meta-analysis where we basically pooled a bunch of studies together to try to see what the impact of volume was, because any one study on its own maybe doesn't tell you enough, but if you group all the studies together, it can give you an idea of what the overall trend is. And so that's kind of, why we did our meta-analysis. And we found an impact of training volume on hypertrophy in that meta-analysis. So, and specifically it was basically double-digit weekly sets seem to be optimal, the best for hypertrophy, so that would be, 10 sets or more per week, total per week. We're obviously better than, doing, 5 or 6 weekly sets per muscle group. So.
Awesome. And in those meta-analysis, for those who are unfamiliar with scientific jargon, as James mentioned, it's just a study of all the studies done on a certain topic, and you did one in 2010 and also in 2016. And you stated that the 2016 was, superior, I guess, to 2010. Can you discuss to, the guys what the key differences were between the second and the first meta-analysis, and the findings from the first one to the second one, if they changed, and how they did change?
Yeah, so The one big difference is just the number of studies. The first one only had 8 studies in it. This one had 15 studies, so we almost doubled the number of studies, which is important. And then the second thing is, in the first one, I looked at sets per exercise. But the problem with sets per exercise is you could do multiple exercises per muscle group, and it doesn't necessarily tell you how much volume you're doing per muscle group if you do look at sets per exercise. And so, so we looked at weekly volume in the second one, which is, a better indicator, and also it makes it easier to apply to the results to your training, versus when you're looking at sets per exercise. But the findings were similar across both studies. I mean, there was a dose response. As you increase your training volume, weekly volume, there was an increase in size gains. Unfortunately, there's not enough research with really high volumes to really get an idea of, at what point does it become too much? All we know is overall, a rough idea is that double-digit weekly sets definitely seem to be better than doing single-digit weekly sets, or your low-volume, HIT programs, stuff like that, are not going to be as good for hypertrophy. Doesn't mean you won't get any gains from those. Even in our analysis, even the low-volume programs, had an average weekly, or not weekly change, an average change of, maybe about 5% change in muscle thickness. So they still achieved gains, but the percentage gain in muscle thickness in the double-digit weekly sets was something like 8.7. It was almost 9%. So it was, quite a bit more, nearly double the gains. Not quite double the gains, but close to it. So
awesome. I guess that's so important for listeners to, bear in mind here, is that although you've said that more is better, everyone will sort of latch on to that and sort of forget the caveat to that to a point. And yeah, there is a ceiling, to which you can continually adapt and progress before you start, detraining and, becoming overreach and all these kind of things. So really important to remember, guys. And with your meta-analysis, there were a number of limitations that you said have, come to light when we're looking at set volume and hypertrophy, and that most of the studies are done in untrained subjects.
Yeah.
And so can you give us a bit of a background as to, what this means, why in fact the researchers would prefer to study hypertrophy on untrained people versus trained, and then what the research tells us about trained populations?
So yeah, there's been very few studies on trained subjects. I mean, most of the studies in our analysis were on untrained subjects. And one of the reasons for that is, number one, it's just harder to get trained subjects to do a study. Sometimes people just don't want to deviate from their normal training programs to participate in research. The people are more serious about it. So it's harder to get trained subjects. And then also, just from a funding perspective, a lot of the research funding on muscle hypertrophy is more based on the need to look at sarcopenia and aging and things like that. And so those populations are typically going to be untrained. And there was a good chunk of studies in our analysis that involved older people, older untrained people. But what's interesting is, even with the older untrained people, that there seems to be a volume effect there too. There was only a few studies in our analysis that involved trained subjects, unfortunately. Right now, Brad Schoenfeld is running a study now on trained subjects and training volume. He's running the first cohort of subjects this semester, so he should be finishing up that cohort pretty soon. Then I think he's running another cohort start of next semester. And I'm going to be analyzing the data for that study, once the data comes in. So that'll be a really needed piece of literature, because he's looking at trained subjects, and he's doing actually 3 different levels of volume, which will be really important. So that'll be an important addition to the literature. But overall, though, the data would suggest that there seems to be a volume of a dose response effect in both untrained and trained subjects. I would say with trained subjects, you probably do need to get a little bit more volume to continue to see gains, just because because you just adapt to the stimulus, and so you have to apply more stimulus to get more continue to see adaptation. So
awesome. And to give the guys the lowdown on all your efforts in understanding the research as it relates to set volume and hypertrophy, what is the general consensus in terms of number of sets? I know you've mentioned double digits, but run us through the key points, I guess, from your research review, James.
So overall, yeah, I in general, I would consider a good guideline to start with is a weekly volume in the teens. So that could be 12 to 18, or 11 to 19, somewhere around that. Most of the data suggests that range seems to give the best gains on average. Now, that doesn't mean that's going to be true for every individual. Some people that may be too much volume for them and they got to do less. Some people that may not be enough volume. There's quite an individual response, and so people have to experiment what levels of volume they give them the best gains. But that's a good rough place to start from. That those weekly volume in the teens, and then you can kind of go from there based on how you respond. So
awesome. And in terms of what we need more of moving forward, we obviously need those studies in trained populations like we were just discussing. Is there anything that you think that is a missing piece to the set volume and hypertrophy puzzle that we could find a lot of value of moving forward?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things. I mean, I think there needs to be more dose response studies like Brad is running right now with multiple levels of volume. Because a lot of the studies will compare just two different levels of volume. There's a lot of studies that just compare 1 set per exercise to 3 sets per exercise. There's a ton of studies like that. But we need more studies that grade the volume. It could be a low, medium, and high volume program.
Yeah.
So we need more research on that. We need more research on the really high volumes to kind of determine where does it become too much, for most people. So we definitely need more data on that. I would like to see just more protein synthesis data looking at volume, volume in a single session or even weekly volume. There's new techniques for measuring muscle protein synthesis now. It's deuterium oxide or something like that. I don't know all the details behind it, but it's a cool way to look at muscle protein synthesis over a time period like a week rather than just single snapshots. Right. And so there's more research coming out using that technique. And I would love to see some research using that technique and looking at training volume. That would be really cool, I think. And then one area I would love to see is, is there a benefit to, for example, cycling your training volume as far as, I think of the Renaissance periodization style method, Mike Israetel, they like to go from a low volume to progressing to a high volume and then backing back down to a low volume and kind of going through those cycles. So, the question is, is there any benefit to that versus just, keeping a certain constant volume? And I think, that would be really interesting to see as well. So I think those are some areas that definitely need more work. So
awesome. And hopefully, we can start to slowly piece together more and more information about everything we need to know for muscle hypertrophy. But I think we're probably a few years off. Would you agree, James?
Yeah.
To say the least, anyway. Well, guys, that's what I had in store for you all today with James. Like I said, make sure that you sign up to weightology.net. James puts out a truckload of weekly content that is super beneficial. I've found useful over all the years that I've been lifting and coaching, and I highly recommend subscribing to, more importantly, get the set volume Bible that he's just put out, which is absolutely brilliant. I'll put a link in the description box to all that, guys. But James, thank you very much for coming on. I hope you have many gains in the near future and yeah, look forward to reading more of your work and that frequency Bible that you're going to be putting out.
Yep. That's the next one. So yeah. Thanks for having me on the show. So
Not a problem, James. Really appreciate it, man. Thanks for your time.